on that. How many of you happen to tune in and hear the Pope's New Year's Day message? I didn't tune in and hear it either. But I did read about it. It was carried on Reuters. It didn't, it was not the kind of thing that made big headlines in the newspaper. The Dallas Morning News didn't have headlines. For that matter, I don't even think the big Sandy Hawkins Journal probably had headlines. But very interesting news story. Reuters release, Dateline, Vatican City. The world needs a new international order to solve its conflicts and ensure peace. Pope John Paul said in his New Year's Day address on Thursday, the ghosts of 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq without United Nations approval, dominated the Pope's first speech of 2004. Quote, more than ever, we need a new international order which draws on the experience and results of the United Nations, the 83-year-old pontiff said at a Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. Now, he didn't say we need to prop up the UN. He didn't say the United Nations is the solution. He said we need a new international order. Well, that presupposes he doesn't think the old international orders work very well. And one of the things that he liked the least about it was that the United States had just gone marching right on into Iraq, even though the French and the Germans and the Russians there at the United Nations didn't like that. In fact, speaking about French and Germans, you hear there was a recent opinion poll taken in a variety of European nations, and they were asking about trust. Trusting, how much trust do you have in various countries? The country that was mistrusted the most in Germany and France? The United States. Two-thirds of the people. Two-thirds of the people polled listed that as the country they distrusted the most. Now that puts us ahead of Castro's Cuba and ahead of North Korea, ahead of Red China. I mean, that's, I can think of a lot of countries I wouldn't particularly trust, but it shows the mindset. In fact, there was an interesting piece on that, an interview on the BBC News that I caught it on the Kilgore station yesterday. Did you notice that the Pope's statement, of course, Pope makes a statement like this. Newspapers didn't carry it. It wasn't a major feature in the news magazines. And yet, what he said is going to have far more significance. I mean, what he described, what he taught, what he said, that's the agenda. And, the time is not too far in the future when there's going to emerge something on the world scene that is going to be hailed as a new international order. Now, he said it needs to be one that draws on the experience and results of the United Nations. What do you think that means? Well, what was their recent experience? They told us not to go to Iraq, and we said, we're going. The result was they said, don't do it, and we said, we are. So, obviously, what he wants is not something just like what we've got. What he wants is something that can produce a different result, isn't it? We live in a time, in the world, so many people, these things, when there's something really significant that comes out. If it makes the news at all, it's a little tiny blurb, maybe buried in the back of the paper somewhere. But in the meantime, dominating the front page will be the latest story of, the Michael Jackson circus called a trial. I mean, that's Kobe Bryant. I mean, that is major news. That deserves the front page. The fact that the Pope says we're going to have a new international order. We need something, and in fact, what he really said was we need something that's going to put the United States in its place and keep it in its place. We need something that's going to produce a different result than what the United Nations does. We need to draw on the experience of the United Nations, and the experience is that it hasn't accomplished much. So we need something different. Now, I don't know. I can't stand here and tell you when that new order is going to appear on the scene. I don't know if Pope had been rereading Revelation 17 and Revelation 13 recently and trying to get his ducks in a row. We did have one. I don't know, maybe we've had more than one, but back a number of months ago, we keep track on our internet website of downloads, and one of the things we keep track of is the country of origin of the download. Now, you can't necessarily have sometimes there may be some that show up that maybe we haven't identified the country, but we have positively identified quite a number, must be approaching 200, but the one that was intriguing to me was a download from Vatican City. So I don't know exactly what they downloaded. I'd be interested to know. But, the world doesn't pay much attention to those things. News stories like this don't rate a whole lot. And the reason, of course, and it does with us, the reason, of course, is that we have a source that puts world news, and it puts what's happening in the world around us, that puts it in perspective. And it's something that, even though there are certainly way more Bibles than people in the United States, the Bible is not really studied as the guide. It's not understood in that way. In fact, what you find is that even, particularly at the so-called schools of higher learning, and that includes the theological schools, theological seminaries, or as Mr. Herbert Armstrong used to like to call them, the theological cemeteries. He called them that because he said that's where they bury the truth. But, you look around at the great so-called divinity schools, Harvard Divinity School, Yale Divinity School, you look at the schools that shape the thinking of the religious establishment. And you find an approach that is totally different toward the Bible than the one that you and I have. You see, starting from the premise that if there is a God, He's sort of remote, and you certainly don't expect direct intervention. That's why you read things you can look up and read in many of the commentaries or various the so-called scholars. Read scholarly opinion. Well, don't really waste your time on most of it. But one of the things you'll find is that, for instance, with the Gospels. Now, they will acknowledge that most of Paul's writings were written probably by Paul, at least most of them will, at approximately the dates we would use. But most of them will tell you with the Gospels, well, all of the Gospels were written after 70 A.D. They weren't really written by the men that claim to have written. They weren't really written by Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Now, you know why they say that? The reason that they claim that all of the Gospels were written after 70 A.D. is because of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. You see, all of those start with the question as they were walking through, coming out of the temple, and they pointed out the magnificent building of the temple, and Jesus said, I'm telling you, there's not a stone left here that's going to be left standing. It's all going to be thrown down. Well, of course, that happened in 70 A.D. So what they do is they look at that and they say, well, obviously, this was all written after 70 A.D. The way we know is because if it had been written before 70 A.D., if that was really an authentic saying of Jesus, then that would mean He knew the future in advance. And since people can't know the future in advance, and there's no way that He could know that the temple was destroyed, obviously He didn't really say that. And so it was written after the event had happened. And so they wrote it down and they just sort of attributed it to Him. And then, of course, they will make comments. They say, why, the people that were with Jesus, why, they wouldn't have been able to write books of the Bible. Well, John, why, he was John the disciple, why, he was a fisherman. Well, how in the world could he have written a book like the Gospel of John? And so they just sort of dismiss it and throw it out. And the real key is they don't want to accept the fact that there's a real God who can intervene, and He does intervene in human affairs, who declares the end from the beginning. It's not that we're an irreligious nation. Oh, religion is popular. Listen to all the politicians. When it gets around election time, boy, they're all talking about God. You think, you wonder whether they're having a revival or an election. They get out and they're talking. I tell you what, when politicians start talking about God, you better grab your pocketbook and hold on tight because they're about ready to lift your wallet. They use all sorts of things because they think that's popular. People like to hear about that in the aftermath of 9/11. All sorts of talk about God. Oh, we had bumper stickers, God bless America, in God we trust. Now, it's interesting, people want religion, but what they want is a religion that just provides comfort. In reality, what they want is a teddy bear God. One that they can sort of take to bed at night with them and tuck them in and make them feel good and they feel safe like a little kid, who if he can latch on to Teddy, he can go to sleep. That's the attitude that a lot of people have. They don't want a God that can tell them how to live. They don't want one that says do this and don't do that. They don't want someone, boy, you want to make them mad. Tell them, but they got to make changes in their life. Tell them that's not right. Oh, boy, you're a fanatic if you start talking about that. If there was anybody who got in trouble in the aftermath of 9/11, the one that they were all the maddest at was anybody, particularly a preacher, who came out and who indicated that there's a possibility that God might want to punish our country. That was outrageous. Why? What in the world would nice folks like us want to, why would he punish us? Well, the reality is far different. This was talked about way back. Peter talked about it in 2 Peter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, look, in the last days, know this also, knowing this first, 2 Peter 3:3, that there will come in the last days scoffers, walking after their own lust, saying, where is the promise of his coming? Everything just continues on the way it was. What's the motivation? He says there are going to be scoffers. People who don't take the Bible seriously. People who don't take God's Word seriously. Why? Well, they want to walk after their own lust. They want to do what they feel like. They want to follow the appetites of the flesh. They don't want somebody telling them how to do, or what to do. They don't want someone saying, thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this. Remember this, forget that. They want to pursue what they want to do. And so they look around and they say, why, everything's just going to go on and on. Why, we'll have our ups and downs and we'll have another election and another crop of politicians and we'll have good economic times and bad economic times and it'll be up and down and everything will get better and better and life's going to go on. Well, they willingly are ignorant of God's intervention in times past, as Peter described here in 2 Peter 3. Now let's look a little bit. I want to look here at not just simply God's revelation in the Bible, but let's look a little bit at the way in which Jesus Christ ensured that what he said was going to accurately be preserved. We don't have to, we don't have to think, well, maybe people 2 or 3 generations later wrote down some things, and you hear of these so-called scholarly seminars. Now, they're really scholarly things. I mean, these guys, they're experts. You heard about the so-called Jesus seminar. They get together all these scholars, and they go through and decide what part of the gospel, what part of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what part of the sayings attributed to Jesus he really said. And what part somebody just made up. Now, they have a very, very scientific way of doing that. Very scholarly, very scientific. They take the verses, and they sort of sit around a table, and they write on there whether they think he said it or not. And they, drop it in a hat, and they pull them out, and they count them. And depends on, if 15 of them think he said it, and 30 of them think he didn't, well, then obviously he didn't. And so they just sort of go from saying to saying, go through there, and why they've, that's real easy. All they got to, well, my opinion is so-and-so. Well, that's ridiculous. And yet, you'll see attention paid when they come out with some pronouncement. You'll see that featured in some news magazine. That'll make the newspaper, the scholars have determined so-and-so. Well, they didn't determine anything. That's just their opinion. And generally, if it was something that he said that they didn't like, either if he foretold the future or he told them to quit doing something they were doing, they didn't figure he said that. if he said, something nice like, love your enemies. Well, they would say, well, yeah, he may have said that. We'll vote okay on that. Well, you don't have to worry about such silliness, because Jesus Christ ensured that his message was going to be accurately recorded and accurately preserved. Back in the book of Acts, chapter 1, we read the story right after Jesus' ascension into heaven. We're told in verse 12 that the disciples returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. It was just a short distance. And they went there in this upper room, and there was Peter and James and John and Andrew and Philip and Thomas and Bartholomew and Matthew and James the son of Alphaeus and Simon Zelotes and Judas the brother of James. These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary the mother of Jesus and with his brethren. And in those days Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples and said, and the number of names together was about 120. Evidently, from the context, that probably includes the women as well, mentioned specifically the women and Mary the mother of Jesus. So the total number of disciples, a disciple is just a learner or a student. Total number was about 120, all the names together. He said, Men and brethren, this scripture must needs have been fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit by the mouth of David spoke before concerning Judas, who was guide to them that took Jesus. He was numbered with us and had obtained part of our ministry. Now this man purchased a field with the reward of iniquity, and falling headlong, he burst asunder in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. And it was known unto all the dwellers at Jerusalem, insomuch as the field was called in their proper tongue, Akeldama, which is to say, the field of blood. It's written in the book of Psalms, and he's quoting here from Psalm 69, Let his habitation be desolate. Let no man dwell therein. And his bishopric or his office let another take. Now notice, okay, he's gone. Peter said, it was prophesied. This reference in the Psalms was clearly a reference to Judas. Then he said, verse 21, Wherefore of these men which have companied with us all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John unto that same day that he was taken up from us, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection. And they appointed two, Joseph, called Barsabbas, surnamed Justus, and Matthias. And they prayed, and they said, You, Lord, which know the hearts of all men, show which of these two you've chosen, that he may take part of this ministry and apostleship from which Judas by transgression fell, that he might go into his own place. They gave forth their lots, and the lot fell upon Matthias, and he was numbered with the 11. Now, you don't find any other account after this of someone being chosen for office by lot. I think a couple of factors. One, clearly, the Holy Spirit had not come, had not been poured out prior to Acts 2. That is recorded right here and just as you go right on. But let me show you another aspect of that. What is it exactly that was being chosen? Jesus had chosen out the 12 from the disciples that he had. He had ordained them. He had commissioned them to go and teach and preach. Though he sent others out to do that as well, sent 70 out later. Jesus had separated out the 12. He'd called them. He had ordained them. He'd given them authority to go out and teach and preach. But that's not all. That's not the only thing they were choosing. Notice what we're told in Revelation 21. Revelation 21, John writes in verse 1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem. Saw it coming down from God. He was taken, verse 10, in the Spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God, having the glory of God, and her light was like a stone, most precious. Verse 12, and it had a wall great and high, and it had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. On the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations. And in them, the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So understand, in Acts chapter 1, when someone was being selected to be numbered with the 11, to make that number back up to 12, what was being chosen was not just someone to go out and preach and teach. Ultimately, what was being chosen was the 12th name to be inscribed in the very foundation of the New Jerusalem. So obviously that's pretty significant. That's not a choice that can be made just on a human level. That was something that needed in a very direct way the supernatural revelation of God. They understood that they couldn't fully arrive at that because what they were selecting went way beyond just something on the human level. You know, in Ephesians chapter 2, when Paul is writing to the church at Ephesus, primarily most of the people, or a significant portion of them, were Gentile, and he talked about how God had made possible through Christ bringing together Jew and Gentile in one body. And so he says in verse 18 that we both, speaking of Jew and Gentile, Ephesians 2:18, have access by one Spirit unto the Father. Therefore you're no more strangers and foreigners, you Gentiles, but you're fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. The whole building is fitly framed together, grows unto a holy temple in the Lord. So the church is here compared to a spiritual building, a spiritual temple. Now in our day, when you hear about somebody, there's going to be they've got this new public building and they're going to have a ceremony, they're going to have the cornerstone laying, or the dedication of the cornerstone. Well, today, when in our modern building practices, that's just sort of a ceremonial act, and there's sometimes a particular corner that's designated as the cornerstone. But the building practices of the first century, laying the cornerstone was not purely a ceremonial act. It was not just sort of a facade that was put up there that had a seal on it. That was the it was the way that everything else from the building was determined, because the cornerstone was laid. When they stretched the line, they stretched it from the cornerstone. They stretched popped the line, stretched the string, and everything was measured out from there. If the cornerstone was off a couple of degrees, then the whole wall was going to be off a couple of degrees. The building would be out of square. The building took its definition from the cornerstone. That was laid, and everything was measured out from there. That was the most essential part, because every other part of the building was going to be measured in its comparison to the cornerstone. It was going to be straight up, straight out, straight back, whatever it was. It was going to be that based on the cornerstone, defined from the cornerstone. What we're told is that the church is built on a foundation that includes the prophets and the apostles. The prophets wrote the Old Testament, the apostles wrote the New. And Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone. Everything takes definition from him. The Old Testament pointed toward him. The New Testament also pointed toward him. It tells us in detail what he taught, what he did. It expounds and builds upon those teachings. When Jesus Christ selected the 12, he was selecting individuals that were going to play a foundational part. The number 12 is significant. It's not just coincidental that Jacob had 12 sons and not 9 or 17 or 13 or 5 or whatever. God had in mind exactly what he was doing. He was building a nation. And that nation was going to be based upon 12 tribes, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the Old Testament church, the congregation of Israel, started out as foundational with the 12 patriarchs. The New Testament church started out foundational with the 12 apostles. And just as there are 12 gates in the New Jerusalem named after the 12 tribes, so there are 12 foundations named after the 12 apostles. Now, let's go back to Acts 10. We saw from what Peter said in Acts 1 that one of the characteristics, one of the things that all of the 12 had in common, and when they selected the replacement, he had to share that, That is, that they were available to be witnesses. You see, they were available to be witnesses because they had been in the group all the time the Lord Jesus went in and out among us. From the beginning with the baptism of John up till the ascension into heaven. They had been witnesses of all of the events from his baptism to his ascension, or certainly all the major events. So, one of the things all the 12 had in common was they all were there at the beginning, and they were there at the end. Now, something else we find, just sort of that's interesting, that's brought out in Acts 2, when the gift of tongues was given, and they were speaking in other languages, and the people that stood around, chapter 2, verse 7, were all amazed and marveled, and they said, Behold, are not all these which speak Galileans? So that's another interesting thing. Evidently, all the 12, that was not something that was, that was their background, that Jesus himself had grown up in Galilee, and all of the 12 that are mentioned right there, the nucleus of the early church, started out with Galileans. And we're going to notice that most of these knew one another. Many of them were related to one another. Now, let's notice here in Acts 10, Peter is speaking to Cornelius. And at this point, he begins to recognize in Acts 10:34 that God is no respecter of persons. And he said in verse 35, In every nation he that fears him, fears God, and works righteousness is accepted with him. The word which God sent unto the children of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ, he's Lord of all. That word, I say, you know, which was published throughout all Judea, began from Galilee after the baptism which John preached. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power, who went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil, for God was with him. And we are witnesses of all things which he did, both in the land of the Jews and in Jerusalem, whom they slew and hanged on a tree. Him God raised up the third day and showed him openly. Not to all people, but to witnesses chosen before of God, even to us who did eat and drink with him after he rose from the dead. And he commanded us to preach unto the people and to testify that it is he which was ordained of God to be the judge of the living and the dead. To him give all the prophets witness that through his name whosoever believes in him shall receive remission of sin. So Peter said, look, the whole Old Testament, the prophets all point to him. To him give all the prophets witness. So the prophets bore witness. Now the apostles bore witness. He said, we are witnesses of all these things. When John wrote in 1 John, writing at the end of the first century, and there were all sorts of heresies and crazy teachings and ideas going around, and you know, every now and then somebody digs up an old book. And they dig up something that dates back to the, may go back even to the second or third century, and it's some crazy thing, and they think, well, we found something old, it must be so. Well, there were a lot of heresies that were going around a long, long time ago. You could find some of those. They haven't found any that go back to the first century, but they could. John said in 1 John chapter 1, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word of life. The word was manifested, and we've seen it, and bear witness, and show unto you that eternal life which was with the Father, and was manifested unto us. So John says, I know what I'm talking about. I was a witness. Those of us who have recorded this were witnesses. We didn't just sort of hear about it. We didn't sit around and sort of think it up. We didn't come up with our theory. We heard him with our ears. We saw him with our eyes. Our hands have handled him. You know, we touched him. We saw him. We heard him. We were there. So that's the relationship these individuals had. Now, we know various things about them and about the area from which they came. You know, the the background. God made preparation for this. This was a very major thing. And so you read that how that Jesus Christ, as he got ready in Luke chapter 6, the 12 weren't ordained. It wasn't just that was as many disciples as Jesus picked up. Well, he had 12, so I guess that's the number he'd go with. That wasn't it. And, Jesus did not select which 12 were going to be the apostles until in the second year of his ministry. It was after the days of unleavened bread in 29 A.D. His ministry started in the fall of 27. Luke tells us that he began to be about 30 years of age. We're told that in Luke chapter 3, that this was Luke chapter 3, verse 23, that Jesus began to be about 30 years of age. That's when he appeared to be baptized by John the Baptist. Now, that was the starting point. Well, it was the following spring. It was about 6 months later that he appeared in Jerusalem, and he cleansed the temple. The first Passover of his ministry. Luke 6 is the Passover season of a year later. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all describe this incident that occurred in the grain fields. Luke is the only one that dates it. He said, Luke 6:1, it came to pass on the second Sabbath after the first. That's the way the King James translates it. If you check it up, it is literally the second first Sabbath, or the second Sabbath of first rank. Well, that's the last day of unleavened bread. That's the second first Sabbath. The first Sabbath is the first day of unleavened bread. So Luke dates it here, and we find this incident, and then verse 12, it came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain to pray, continued all night in prayer to God, and when it was day, he called unto him his disciples, and of them he chose 12, whom also he named apostles. So the 12 were not fully separated out from the others until shortly after the days of unleavened bread in the second year of Jesus' ministry. John records 3 out of the 4 Passovers of Jesus' ministry. He records the first one when he came in and cleansed the temple. He records the third one, which was the Passover of 30 A.D., that began that final year sequence of his ministry. John records that there in John chapter 6. You realize that John 6 on to the end of his book is basically the story of the last year of Jesus' life. Most of the Gospel of John is devoted to his last year. He records the Passover season of 30 A.D., and is the one who explains to us that the feeding of the 5,000 and the miracle of walking on the water occurred immediately before Passover. Then he records the sermon that Jesus gave in the synagogue there in Capernaum, which was most likely on the first holy day of unleavened bread. And then he records on through the fall festival season in John 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 of that year, the fall festival of 30 A.D. Then he records the raising of Lazarus, which occurred a little bit later, after maybe the equivalent of January, February, and then he records Jesus there in John 13 coming back into Jerusalem for the Passover, his final Passover. He does not need to record the second Passover because Matthew, Mark, and Luke all do. It was right after that he chose the 12. Now let's go back and let's understand a little bit more about where these 12 came from. We saw that they were all Galileans. John records a few more details. John, of course, was written by one who was himself an eyewitness. He knew the inside out. John, you realize there are only a few accounts that all 4 Gospels record. All 4 of the Gospels tell about John the Baptist and Jesus' baptism. All 4 of the Gospels tell about the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water. All four of the Gospels tell about Jesus' final Passover, his crucifixion and ascension, or crucifixion, resurrection. Then that's, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover a lot of things together. John covers some other things. But they all start with the baptism of John, or start with that very early in the sequence. And so we find in John chapter 1, verse 19, this is the record of John, speaking of John the Baptist. When the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" John just one day showed up. Now, there had been quite a stir around the time of his birth, about 30 years earlier. Remember, John the Baptist was 6 months older than Jesus. And it had created quite a stir because his father, the elderly priest Zacharias, was in the temple at the festival season. And he was in the temple and saw this vision of an angel and came out and was struck dumb and couldn't speak, and you can read the details of it in Luke's account. Well, that created quite a stir. There's thousands of people there in the temple complex, and that's the kind of thing that gets quite a bit of commotion. But Zacharias just sort of disappeared from public view. He went on back home. His wife conceived this little child, and John grew up in sort of a remote area. 30 years passed. 30 years ago, that'd be 1974. You just instantly recall all the great news events of 1974 off the top of your head, particularly the ones that haven't been in the news since then. So John the Baptist, time went by, and this was sort of in the back of, it sort of slipped away from what people were consciously thinking about. One day, John the Baptist showed up there in the area of the River Jordan. Now, the River Jordan flows from the Sea of Galilee in the north, flows down to the Dead Sea in the south. And if you have a Bible map, you might want to look at some of this back there and sort of give you a visual of it. The ancient area of Israel, where all the tribes were, there were invasions and captivities and all sorts of things back and forth. What you had in the days of Christ was the southern province of Judea, which was basically equivalent to the old southern kingdom of Judah. Then you had, sort of in the middle, Samaria, which had been, let's say, the southern half of the old northern kingdom, and had been settled by these Samaritans that the Assyrians had brought in. But then up around the Sea of Galilee, the area called Galilee, which referred to sort of a circle, is actually the origin of the term. It was sort of a circle of settlement around, starting on the west of the sea and coming up north of it and down around on the southern, on the eastern side of it. And that was Jewish as well, primarily, though there were at least some Gentiles. There was Greek settlement through that area as well. That area, by the time of Jesus, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that by the time of Jesus, that Galilee was the area that had the largest population. It had more towns and cities. It was still heavily forested. There were a lot of trees up there. The area down around Judea had become deforested. It was much more desolate. And of course, when you cut down all the forest, well, then the rain patterns change and a lot of these other things. That area down around Jerusalem was no longer a land flowing with milk and honey. It looked a little more like what it looks like now. The area, Josephus, of course, was contemporary. He records a sort of a first-person account. But the only claim to fame that the ones down around Jerusalem had, it was not economic prosperity. That was a more, an area that was in much worse shape economically. Their claim to fame was, we live near Jerusalem, and therefore we're closer to God than you are. Because God lives here, and we're His next door neighbor. That was sort of their mentality. If you're from Galilee, you guys may, the economy may be a little better up there, and you may have a little more, but you live a long way from where God does. He lived down here with us in Jerusalem. And this was sort of the mindset. So the folks in that area, which was down in the area of Judea, looked down. Everybody thinks they need to look down on somebody, and they come up with different reasons. And You can look down on somebody because he has less than you do, but you can also look down on somebody because he has more than you do. It's just, basically you can look down on somebody for just about any reason you want to come up with. Somebody probably does. Now, there were a number of things that generated prosperity up in Galilee. One was the land was richer and just it was more trees and more rain. Another factor was the Sea of Galilee. Fish was a major staple. You read even the Roman historians as well as evidence from there in the area of Israel. And you find fish was a major element of the diet. But fresh fish couldn't be readily transported. You didn't have any refrigeration. How would you like for somebody to show up and want to give you a fish? It's one they caught 3 days ago. They just sort of had him hanging on a string for the last 3 days. He hadn't been iced down because they didn't have any ice. I didn't have an ice chest to put him in. They just sort of brought him along, and had him laying in a sack. Well, don't you know he'd really smell good? Boy, that's just, you wouldn't want to get close. So what they did, unless you live right close to the coast, then fresh fish was not easily available. That wasn't an option. You didn't have a way of preserving it fresh. But they did have a way of preserving it. They salted it and pickled it. They dried it. And that was a major thing. They created they had all sorts of fish products. There were fish pastes, that were, put in jars and shipped across the Mediterranean. There were smoked fish and salted fish and all sorts of things, that were readily used. Now, Jerusalem itself was far enough away from the coast that you didn't eat fresh fish in Jerusalem, because it wouldn't be fresh by the time it got to you. The two primary places, Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, which was a good 3 days away, over on the Mediterranean, and you could do a little bit of fishing in the Jordan River, but not enough to, it was not commercially viable. That would be the other place. The commercial fishing areas were basically the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean. Well, one of the anchors of prosperity up in the area of the Sea of Galilee was controlled by Jewish fishermen. In the Mediterranean, you had Tyre and Sidon and various Gentile enclaves that were right on the Mediterranean, and it wasn't that some Jews didn't fish the Mediterranean, but it was heavily, much of that fishing area was controlled by Gentiles. Now, if you're a Jew, and you're concerned about clean and unclean, when you get fish that's already been cleaned, it's been salted or pickled, it's been sliced, you look at it and you can't tell. There is no way in the world you can look at it and tell what it is. The Jews wouldn't take the word of Gentiles for what kind of fish it was. Because, once it came that way, you had to take somebody's word for it. Now, if you went in the meat market, you could see the carcass hanging up there. You didn't need somebody to tell you, if you're familiar with animals, well, then you know the difference between a pig and a goat. That's not too hard to figure out. They didn't buy them in packages where it was all ground up and, somebody had squirted a little coloring agent on there to make sure it looked just the right color and put cellophane over it, and that's not the way they got their stuff. So, normally Jews, even Jews throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, they didn't want to buy fish except fish that came from Jewish sources, because they felt like that you could take their word for it. They wouldn't try to slip off the catfish on you or something. And particularly in Judea. So the fish was a major product throughout the Mediterranean world, but fish from the Sea of Galilee brought a premium price because it was certified by Jewish fishermen. And so Jews throughout the empire, they wanted that kind rather than the other kind. The point of it being that fishing was a good business. You didn't get rich in the sense of rich, but you made a good living. It was a good income. When you read about Peter and his brother Andrew and James and John, you find that they were partners. They had a big enough fishing enterprise that they were partners. They had employees, servants. Peter and Andrew's dad was involved, and so you read about all that. You read about multiple boats. You read that Peter and Andrew and some of the others were able to sort of come and go, and in the early part, you would see them here, and then the next thing you know, they were back fishing again. it's interesting that, some archaeological excavations, a lot of them don't turn up anything of much value, but one of the cities that has been fairly heavily excavated is the city of Capernaum. And they feel for a variety of reasons that they have identified the actual house that was Peter's house there in Capernaum. In fact, there's some things that have come out because they've come to understand a little bit about that. The house was a stone house. It was right there. It was a little larger than the average house in Capernaum, and it was down right near the waterfront. They've discovered the way that they had this built in, where they had all these docks for the boats coming in. They've sort of done models of it and show you where the boats could be parked there, anchored, and protected from the storms. Because Sea of Galilee has an area, is a lot of storms and squalls come up. Interestingly, the house that they've identified as Peter's house, and there's several reasons that they have. I mean, they've actually, it has been designated as that locally. That site has been considered, they've got records at least going back to the 2nd century that have identified that. That's probably, most of them say that that's probably the only site in terms of the so-called holy sites that is probably accurate, that most of them were just made up in about the 4th century when Constantine's mother showed up and wanted to see where this happened and that happened, and somebody just spun a good yarn, told a good story, and they planted a Catholic church there, and, life went on. But from everything that they've discovered there in Capernaum, there's nothing they've turned up. If that's not Peter's house, he undoubtedly lived in one that was close to there and must have been very similar to it. It was sort of where you would expect, right down by the waterfront. It was very short distance. The synagogue was only a couple of streets back behind there. Christ spent a lot of time in Capernaum. Now, there's a reason. Peter was not from Capernaum originally. It says right here in John, I'll show you that here in John chapter 1. We see John the Baptist. He baptized Jesus, and he said that in verse 31 of John 1, I didn't know who he was. I didn't recognize him by sight, but that he should be made manifest to Israel. Therefore I'm come baptizing with water. John bore record, saying, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it abode upon him. And I didn't know him, but he that sent me to baptize with water, the same said unto me, upon whom you see the dove, the Spirit descending, and remaining on him, the same as he was baptized with the Holy Spirit. So there was a miracle that took place. Actually, there were two miracles. One was the dove descending, and the other was the voice out of heaven. Remember that Peter said in Acts 1 that those who were chosen to be the 12, one, they had to have been there with John at the baptism of John. They were witnesses to that miracle where God identified Jesus Christ. They were also witnesses to his death, his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven. They had to be there to see the miracle at his baptism. John had crowds, large crowds. There were many people who came, thousands upon thousands of people, some of whom maybe only stayed for the day, and others stayed around for quite a while. Well, notice what happened. John said, in verse 34, I saw, and I bore record that this is the Son of God. So everybody who was with John called their attention. He says, this is the one I've been talking about. The next day, after John stood, two of his disciples, and looking upon Jesus as he walked, John told his disciples, he said, behold, the Lamb of God. That's the one. The two disciples heard him speak, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned, and he saw him following, and he said, who are you looking for? And they said, well, Rabbi, teacher, where are you staying? Where do you dwell? And he said, well, come and see. So they came and saw where he dwelt, and they stayed with him that day. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And one of the two which heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon, and he said, come here, we found the Messiah. Which is, that's the Hebrew term, Christ is the Greek. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus beheld him, and he said, well, you're Simon the son of Jonah. We're going to call you Rock from now on. See, Peter. The next day, Jesus was getting ready to go back to Galilee, and he found Philip, who was right there. Evidently, Philip had been in the area. Now, he said to Philip, follow me. Notice, Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Peter and Andrew were from Bethsaida. And Philip was a friend of theirs. He was from the same town. Philip went and found a friend of his, a fellow by the name of Nathanael, and he said, you got to come. We found the Messiah. He's the one that Moses wrote of in the law, and all the prophets, they wrote about it. His name is Jesus of Nazareth. And Nathanael, who didn't have a subtle bone in his body, said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And Philip said, well, come and see. You know, when Jesus met Nathanael, he said, well, I see you're an Israelite in whom there's no guile. Nothing deceitful about you. Whatever it is, just there it is. Now, it mentions Bethsaida. If you look at a Bible map, you'll find that Bethsaida is over, if you look at the Jordan River is going up and down, it flows into the Sea of Galilee at the top. But if you just continue the line straight up, you'll find that Bethsaida is over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. And you'll find that right up just on the north edge of the Sea of Galilee, but just slightly west of that line made by the Jordan River, is Capernaum. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why, as you go on through the Gospel accounts, you find Peter had a house in Capernaum. See, when King Herod died, the Romans sort of divided things up among his children. In fact, Luke even records that in Luke chapter 3, verse 1, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. That's who was the emperor. Pontius Pilate being the governor of Judea. Herod, or Herod Antipas, being the tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and the region Trachonitis and Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. So Philip was tetrarch or ruler over on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and Herod Antipas had the area of Galilee proper. Now, you know, politicians then, like politicians now, were always looking to rake up a few extra tax dollars. There was sort of a huge, not by our term of huge, but huge for the time and the circumstance. There was a big fish processing place that was located south of Capernaum. In fact, it was the town of Magdala. We know it because of Mary Magdalene, that was where she was from. The word actually goes back, the Hebrew word for which it was named means tower, and it referred to the Greeks called it by another name that had to do with fish processing. They had places there where they salted and smoked the fish, and it was shipped out. That was the main processing place. That was over on Philip's part. Well, that meant fishermen from around the Sea of Galilee brought their fish over there to have it processed, to be shipped. Well, he saw a good opportunity to make a little extra money, so he set up a toll booth at Capernaum, which was right on the border of his territory between him and his brothers. Set up a toll booth, and everybody whose boats were not, who was not resident on his side of the lake and whose boat did not have his home port, one of the towns that was in his domain, well, if you brought it in from the other side, you had to pay the toll. You had to pay the tariff to import it in, to bring it in and have it processed. See, Matthew, if you read the story carefully, where did they find Matthew? Well, he was the fellow at the toll booth. He was the collector of tribute right there in Capernaum. You know, when you read in the Gospels later on, when Jesus was there in Capernaum and he looked at Peter and he said, I want you to leave all this stuff and come on and follow me. Well, Peter had already met him months earlier. You see, when Jesus initially met the disciples, they were all there. At one point or another, we don't know exactly how many altogether, but it was inclusive of the 12. Well, we know that there were at least 14 that were there, because we know that 2 of them are named in Acts chapter 1 as possibilities. You know, they settled on, said it could have been, maybe it could be the Justus here, or it could be Matthias. They've both been with us through the whole thing. You see, Judas was dead by that time. He'd been one of the original 12. These two, who both had been there, they were selected out, giving you the indication there were several others that had been, but they sort of settled. They said, it's got to be one of these two, obviously. They just sort of stand out head and shoulders, but we don't know for sure which one, because God obviously has one selected, and so they depended on His supernatural revelation. But the original group that collected around Jesus, He met them there at the baptism of John. They had already been there. John pointed him out to them. So that's the Lamb of God. That's the one I've been talking about. Well, they collected around Him, and we're told the story of several of them right here. The first two, clearly Andrew is the first one mentioned. The second disciple is not mentioned by name. I think clearly it must be John himself, because he's the one who, all through the Gospel of John, never mentions himself by name. But he was there as a witness on all these things. And, if he wasn't the second one, he was certainly in the original group, but I think that's just my opinion on it, that he and Andrew that were the original two. And then Andrew went and got Peter, and John probably went and got his brother James, and then here came Philip, and here came Nathaniel, and various of the others, and they all met up, and they left and went back to Galilee, which is where they were all from. John chapter 2, verse 1, the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus was called and His disciples to the marriage. So most of these people were from that general area, and this, of course, they wanted wine, and his mother said to Jesus, well, they're out of wine. They need, can you do something? And Jesus said, what do you think that I need to do? What have I to do? Notice the end of verse 4, my hour is not yet come. When you put John's account together carefully with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what you find is that right after the baptism of John, 3 days later, Jesus goes back to Galilee, up there to Cana in the wedding feast. But then he sort of disappears, because when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account, you find that he went out into the wilderness, fasted for 40 days, was tempted of Satan, came back to Capernaum. And it mentions in John 2, verse 12, how he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples went to Capernaum, stayed there for a little while, and then came to Jerusalem for the Passover. Jesus comes boldly into the temple, cleanses the temple, performs miracles on the feast day right in the temple proper. Clearly, something had happened between that point and the time earlier when he said, my time is not yet come. He had not yet confronted Satan and vanquished him in terms of what occurred in the wilderness. Now, as you go on through the story, you find that a little while after this Passover season, Jesus remained there. It mentions in John chapter 3 and verse 21 that John the Baptist was baptizing in Anan near to Salem because there was much water there. They came and were baptized. Now, just sort of as an aside, John practiced sprinkling or pouring or something. He didn't need to be in a place where there's much water. All he needed was a bucket. He was in an area where the water was deep enough that you could take people out and immerse them. It was not one of the real shallow sections of the Jordan River, and neither was it so deep that you couldn't get out there. John was not yet cast in prison. Well, as you come on down a little bit, that you find that Jesus stayed for a few weeks, he and his disciples, and they were baptizing people there along the Jordan River. That's mentioned in the beginning of John chapter 4. Then, John 4 verse 3, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account make plain that the catalyst for his leaving was Herod put John in prison. Remember, Herod Antipas took his brother Philip's wife. And John the Baptist didn't pull any punches, and he didn't just get kicked off the television station. He got thrown in jail. Back in those days, they could get a little more serious about it than they will again. Jesus, we're told, after John was put in prison, Jesus went into Galilee preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God, was back up there, so that when you read in the account in Luke 4, you find that it was on Pentecost, just a matter of 7 weeks, after the Passover season that's recorded here in John, that he, in the synagogue in Nazareth, did these these things. Now, let me, in Luke 4, verse 14, we're told that Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit into Galilee, and there went a fame of him through all the region round about. And as you go through and you read the account, you find that Jesus had many of those had been in Jerusalem at the feast day, and they were familiar with the miracles that Jesus had performed in Jerusalem, and they wanted to see some of the same things. And so what we find as we go through the Gospels is that Jesus called out these men. He prepared individuals who were to witness these events. A number of them were fishermen, businessmen. Matthew was an official that worked for the government. We're not told specifically what all of the others did, but it's some interesting things we know just about the area. One, it was a multilingual area. Aramaic was the common everyday speech of the Jews. But if you were in business, if you had dealings with the Roman world, you had to speak Greek. If you were involved in business or commerce, that was the commercial language of the Roman Empire. We find references to that, several things. One, that some of the disciples, like Peter, Simon was the Greek spelling of his name, Simeon was the Hebrew spelling of his name. Normally you find it used in the Greek form. Simon is the way he's usually called. In the book of Acts, when James addresses him, James the brother of Jesus, he uses the Hebrew form, Simeon. But you also find that his brother Andrew is a Greek name. It has no exact Hebrew equivalent, as that several of the others, Andrew, Philip, those were names that were primarily Greek names, which means that Greek was widely spoken in Galilee. In fact, just about 45 minutes to an hour's walk from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, was the capital city of Galilee, and it was an area. There was a huge building project going on there for decades, basically during the time of Jesus growing up. There had been sort of a riot there right before Jesus' birth, and the governor of Syria had come down with his Roman legion and had burned the place down. Well, that created a problem, and so they needed to rebuild, and a lot of Roman money was poured into it, and it was a growing area, and would have been a good source of employment if you were a builder, because there was a lot of building going on there for decades as they built not only dwellings, but Roman administrative buildings and public bathhouses and all sorts of things that were built. And it's sort of interesting to read a little bit about some of that. Here were people who had a background. Now, the Pharisees and the religious leaders labeled them as ignorant and unlearned men. Now, is that really what they were? Well, the story is told in the book of Acts that Peter and John were arrested, and they were brought before the high priest, and Acts 4:13, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. See, here were people that hadn't been to their approved schools. They hadn't graduated from the Harvard Divinity School or the Yale Theological Seminary of the day. They hadn't even gone to Azusa Pacific. They were, where did they get their education? Well, they'd been with Jesus. They'd been with Jesus. See, they hadn't sat there at the feet of various of the scribes in Jerusalem. They had been with Jesus. Now, the religious establishment looked down on them as ignorant men. They looked down on Mr. Armstrong and said, well, where did he get his degree? Right here. That's where he got it. They looked down on me and you and Mr. Meredith and any number of us. Said, well, you don't know. You haven't been to one of our approved schools. They had gotten what they knew directly from the teaching of Jesus. Now, they grew up in the area where they lived. They grew up attending the synagogue. They grew up learning to read from the scrolls. Jesus, we're told, at age 12, was sitting there in the temple after the Passover, and they were having discussions, and he sat there and joined right in. But you see, these men didn't come seeking the approval of other people. Many of them were successful in their own walk of life. They had businesses. They were making a living. Virtually all of them were married. We know Peter was, because we're told about Jesus healing his mother-in-law. We also have the reference back in 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about the fact of in 1 Corinthians 9. In verse 4, he says, verse 3, my answer to them that examine me is this: have we not power, speaking of himself and Barnabas, have we not power to eat and to drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas? Have not we power to forbear working? Making the point clearly that the fact that most of the other apostles were married, took their wives with them on trips, did so at the, let's say at church expense. Paul and Barnabas, Paul had been, while he was in Corinth, had worked as a tent maker and earned his own way. And some of the Corinthians, instead of realizing that why he had done that, they said, well, Paul is obviously doesn't have quite the status these other guys do. Paul said, we're just as entitled to it as they are. But he mentioned specifically that Christ's brothers, that Peter, and various of the other apostles, not necessarily every single one of them, but the clear implication is that Paul and Barnabas were unusual in that they were not married. The rest of them not only were married, they often took their wives with them. You find that Christ called men who he just didn't walk by and these people sort of go into a zombie-like trance and follow him. These were men that God had been working with. These were men who had come and heard John the Baptist. These were men that John the Baptist had pointed out to Jesus. These were men that had accompanied Jesus on up to the wedding feast. They'd seen the water turn to wine. They had seen and heard various of these things. And so, as time would go by, they would go back and sort of go back to their business for a little while. When the time came, that Jesus came by and said, all right, I want you to come with me and be a fisher of men from now on. And we're told that they forsook all. They walked away. They left it behind. They knew who he was. They believed it, and they came to see it and understand it more clearly and to believe it more deeply throughout the rest of his ministry. They were witnesses of these things. They saw the beginning. They saw the beginning of his ministry. They saw the baptism by John. They saw the testimony of God himself at that occasion. They saw the works that Jesus did. They heard the things that he taught. They saw him. They heard him. They touched him. They knew the reality of it. They were at the Last Supper. They watched him die. And they saw him alive. And they watched him ascend up to heaven. And he told them, I want you to go everywhere and tell everybody. I want you to go and teach all nations all the things that I have commanded you. So, they had that background. We don't have to, when you go through and you read the gospel accounts, you don't have to wonder, well, I wonder if Jesus said this or if he didn't say that. It's recorded by individuals who not only were under the inspiration of God's Spirit. There was first-hand direct testimony that was available from the 12 of what Jesus had said and done. They knew it. And so the things that they taught were authoritative not only for that time and that day, but they come right on down to our day. And that's why when we look at world events and we look at the things that are happening and you see a news item like this one from Reuters, that's how you can fit it all together and know, because we have the direct testimony of Jesus Christ preserved by eyewitnesses as to what the future holds and what is the plan and the purpose that is being worked out. A plan and a purpose that you and I have a part of.